Okay. First of all, while you're doing that, I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity today to be here. I'm honored. I'm not a Texas A&M graduate by any means. Full disclosure, I went to Texas Tech, and I will say Molly did too, even though she may not admit that. But I'd also like to thank Molly, senior counsel at Baker Botts, for being here today. I think you'll really be blessed by her input. So appreciate it. I wanted to say before we get started, my career path took a wild ride. I think it was about 7 years. So I hope to give you a glimpse of this in the time, we have allowed today. It was all related to a water permitting process, basically around my quarry. So we'll get into that here in a second. And so slide 1 here, the title you see, It's Never Too Late. That was a quote I heard actually from a man speaking at the Texas Aggregate and Concrete Association annual convention that I attended when I was in the biggest mess of my whole life. And I can't even emphasize how bad it was. So you can go to slide 2, please. And before you play the video, I just want to let you know, this is my business. It was in complete turmoil. We had legislation written against us by a newly elected state representative that was actually younger than me at the time. And I had several lawsuits related to water. I had organized opposition using the internet to expose me on every front of my business exploration. And the homeowners next door had actually passed a dues increase through their association to fight me. So go ahead and play that video and give you a little glimpse of where we were and what we were doing.
Oops, let me back it out a bit.
You click on the middle of it and it'll play.
Correlation with population and expansion and the need for natural resources to support that growth.
Jill Shackelford converted this land in Hays County from a cattle ranch to a quarry in 2011. Here, like at a typical quarry, workers blast several feet down, loosening rock that is then ground into large stockpiles before it is sold to construction companies in Texas and beyond. We crunched state data and found that in 2012, there were 52 registered rock mining.
Okay. So back to that original slide, you don't have to go there, but I heard those 4 words because I was in the biggest mess, and it really changed my life at the time and my perspective on business. So I want to get started just telling you how, my mess sort of became my message. And I feel like your students and whoever can accomplish, whatever you put your mind to, because if I can do it, believe me, anyone can. So if you'll go to slide 3 there, those are our businesses. Basically, long story short, for the sake of time, I went to work for my dad's paving company out of college. I got bored after about 2 days. And so I knew I really wanted to vertically integrate my dad's company. And I began to analyze how much asphalt he was selling, to third-party suppliers. And basically, I wrote a business plan to permit, acquire, and operate my own asphalt plant so I could sell back to his company and others. And it was kind of a big process, but I just stayed with it. So vertical integration was really the key. You can go to the next slide, please. So my personal beliefs, I found mentors and experts to ask questions to. And I read and I learned everything I could to get my hands on about asphalt. I decided to take the high road when it was even more difficult. And I vowed to never compromise in my business or my personal life. And so that was kind of the theme of what I planned to do. So with that, I kind of just built my knowledge. I became a certified asphalt specialist, which meant I knew how to test the asphalt from the plant being where it was produced actually to the roadway. And through those years, I kept vertically integrating. And so then I got myself in a position to be able to produce aggregate or rock and sand that went into the asphalt because I knew I needed it. And I was relying on a third party at the time. So we were basically multiple entities operating independently, but selling to each other and third parties, which was called an independent company structure.
I think I want you to elaborate on what never compromise means, because it's a personal thing, not an external thing. And doesn't mean that you go meet with the protesting parties and don't listen and don't try to do what they want. It is not a never compromise, a never settle. It's a personal commitment of having your values and having your morals and not bending those.
Correct. Yes. It's meant to me, never compromise was, look, we got to do the right thing. We've got to stay the course. We've got to stay ethical, because when you're challenged and you have that much opposition, it's really easy to get mad and be ugly. And so we just kind of backed up and vowed to, it's not going to compromise on this. We're going to take the high road. And I say that a lot because someone told me that at the time and it just stuck in my brain. And so, yes, it wasn't financially compromise. It was more ethics. So, it was doing the right thing, even if it felt wrong, and just choosing to take the high road. And so you'll see throughout this presentation, and we'll get to the water part shortly, but that really proved to be an asset along the way with all the litigation challenges and organized opposition that I had. And I took that value into dealing with regulators, stakeholders, and anyone that was really interested in my operation. Okay, you can go to the next slide, which is going to play into this. And so ethics, I was a firm believer, and I heard this quote that said, you either have them or you don't. There's no such thing as business ethics. And I encourage you guys to remember this, you that are in grad school. I want you to remember that you don't just have personal ethics that are compromised in business, and your business ethics shouldn't be that are not parallel with your personal philosophy. So it's keeping that balance and not compromising either one of them. The taking the high road, I mentioned that. And in my business venture, this was a direct reflection of ethics, of doing the right thing, the ethical thing to do. And again, even when it didn't feel like it, and it would have been much easier for me to take a shortcut. And there's plenty of opportunities to take those in this industry. But I feel like, we stuck to never doing that, and it really helped and paid off in the long run. Next slide, please. And so briefly, my management style, it was called total quality management style. I really invested in my employees. We wanted to retain them. We wanted them to know their value and that they're part of our business. We believed the customer was always right, and wanted them to feel that way. That was kind of our quality control plan. We really worked as a team on every aspect of the business. And when I tried to live what I was preaching to my employees and create an atmosphere, where we really wanted to come to work each day, and we made it fun, even in the midst of all this chaos and litigation and craziness. So I was pretty secure in my management style. And that sort of became a problem in the long run, but we can go to the next slide. This is when it all blew up. I kind of got real comfortable and confident in my management style. So you can go ahead and play this video. This is a blast on top of the Barton Springs segment of the Edwards Aquifer. So that's what we were doing. We started off blasting once a month, then it became, twice a month, and it was 2 or 3 times a week as we were finally in full production. And so really, this was the final piece of our vertical integration of our companies that you saw on my business card, was to open a rock quarry. Everything was dependent on the aggregate. If we didn't have the aggregate source, and Texas is depleting its resources, we were never going to make it in the long run. It'd been something I really wanted to do. I had it in my mind. I had no experience in mining, but it was a challenge to me, and that's what I like. So as the introduction, talked about in that video, I took a working cattle ranch that I leased from an employee's parents, and I turned it into a rock quarry. But it had one significant milestone that had to be achieved, is that we had to acquire and get water. So we were blasting and mining, over the Edwards. And again, that was to sell to ourselves and sell to third parties and anyone really in the road building and home industry. And so sort of to summarize my mentality at the time, I had my land. I was operating under a small permit called a permit by rule that allowed me to open the ground and get started and get some revenue. But I needed water and I didn't have it and I really didn't know how to get it at the time. I just knew I needed it and I was going to figure it out. And so this involved, obtaining the appropriate authorizations from the local groundwater district, the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer Conservation District. And you can go to the next slide. And so why we needed water, in case you're not familiar with the mining industry, you are required to wash the aggregate to get the fine particles or dust off the aggregate. So it's clean enough to go on a state highway or roadway, and it will meet the Department of Transportation specifications. So it's safe. And we needed it to process the aggregate as well and size it. And then one of the big uses we needed was for dust control. Because when you're breaking rocks and blasting and, mining, you're creating a lot of dust. And so water is a great dust suppression. And so we knew that was going to be needed at this particular site. And we thought we would be able to, just really easily get the groundwater permit for a well and drill to the Trinity Aquifer or the Edwards, or we could buy from the public water supply, but that was pretty expensive at the time. Okay, next slide. But with any operation, water is great, but there's also challenges with water, because when you remove the fine particles from the aggregate, it creates a bunch of silt and nasty material that usually is put in a settling pond, which then has to be cleaned out. In this industry, or in Texas in general, water is pretty scarce and it's a very valuable resource. And so we had that challenge. Then how are we going to discharge our water? How is it going to be clean when it was discharged? Because we were really being under the microscope of people thinking we were going to pollute the aquifer. And then recovery was a challenge. We wanted to recover and recycle as much water as possible. In the beginning, when we were designing our plant, and it was a wet plant, which required a lot of water. And so we were aiming to build a plant that would process our aggregates, but also really minimize the amount of fresh water that we needed. And then additional challenges in this industry, you can have water-related accidents. You've got electrical equipment around water that's dangerous. You've got ponds that pieces of equipment can fall into, or the walls can collapse on those. And so there's just all kinds of potential dangers and risks associated with water in the mining aggregates industry that a lot of people don't know about.
I wanted to add one parameter to this. That is the biggest rule out there, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to talk about the law, but the big limitation on using water, especially to wash rock, is the concept of waste. In every water issue that you come up with, someone will always say, but this is a waste of water. And one man's waste is another man's purpose. I'll tell you that in the early years of my water practice, people would actually make the claim that allowing water to flow down the rivers and into our bays was a waste, because that water could be put to beneficial use, and it wasn't. It was just going out to the sea. And it took until the middle of the last decade for the law to catch up with the fact that, wait a minute, freshwater inflows into bays and estuaries is actually a good thing. There is a usage there, and we ought to protect it. But I can assure you that in 2014, when you were in Austin, Texas, and people couldn't get their boats out to ski on Lake Travis, the concept of using Edwards water to wash dirt was not popular.
Very, very unpopular. That's right. Thank you. That's awesome. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So I had all my, strategy and plan and somewhat of an arrogant attitude because I was operating. And so I made a huge mistake. Back to the slide where it said things literally blew up. I really estimated the opposition. I had a call from the press one day. I'll never forget it. I was sitting on my back porch and they called me and they wanted to know if I was going to appear at a hearing for and this was actually a public meeting for the local groundwater district. And I quoted off the record, which I'll never do ever again. I'll ever put it in writing, is, you know, what I learned from that. I said, I'm not coming to that public meeting because I don't want to be a sitting duck. And that statement haunted me for 5 years. And so later y'all can click on that link and read the story. And the second biggest mistake was actually not having a representative at the meeting, even if it wasn't me, whoever, you know, could have sent someone. And so just communication mistakes that I learned from dealing with these groundwater districts and the public in general. And so this really propelled me down a path of opposition when it blew up. You know, lawsuits. We had a bill introduced by the state rep I mentioned that was like an isolated, he targeted an isolated quarry operating on a sole source aquifer, and he basically just nailed it down right to our site, no one else. And so, you know, if that bill would have passed, it would have put us out of business, but it had a big impact on the industry as well. And so, you know, we also were in a situation, we were having hearings for either air permits or the water well application, and we had to, you know, have a security guard with us because it was so controversial. And then the biggest thing that happened that impacted me that Molly will have input on is the local court shut my business down because there was a missing piece of information on our application for a water pollution abatement plan. And I'll let Molly speak to that here for a second.
So one of the things that Jill is emphasizing is both transparency and communication. The other thing you need to know is what are the rules of the game. I mean, everybody wants to preserve and use water wisely, but you have to have someone read the rules of the game, interpret them, and understand them. And in this particular instance, what you had was a consultant who had actually never done a project that involved this thing called a water pollution abatement plan. It's a unique requirement, regulatory requirement, when you're operating over the Edwards Aquifer. And that slapped together a reasonable plan and submitted it, and the agency approved it. But it was missing pieces, and the court said, this isn't here. And boom, pulled the rug out from under Jill. And then she didn't have the authorizations that she needed to operate, period.
And you go to the next slide, it'll show that water pollution abatement plan for your students. I didn't really have any idea the impact of a water pollution abatement plan. And I will interject that this was reviewed by an attorney I had before I met Molly. And so it took a different path than it should have. But really it's required, you know, for any regulated activity that's over the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone. And you can read about it under the 213 rules. But what happened to us actually is we, like she said, my environmental consultant at the time kind of slapped one together, and then I got a little paranoid. And so I asked them to be really aggressive on making sure, you know, we didn't miss anything. And they ended up identifying a lot of sensitive features that were proven and later on to not be sensitive. And that caused a huge issue and just multiple just wrong tactics, not intentional. I just think it was from lack of experience and also not preparing a permit that will hold up under the, you know, worst scrutiny that you could have. So anyway,
I would be remiss if I didn't tell one quick side story. When you're building anything, you have interim measures that you implement while the construction is ongoing. And then you have your final BMPs. And that's a really important distinction, because if you're building a mine, you are in, as we argued, you're in interim construction the whole time until you finally finish building your mine, at which point you don't really need any stormwater protection, because all the stormwater goes into your pit and it sits in there, or it seeps into the aquifer. And we ended up in a battle on whether, as we were constructing the mine under this WPAP, whether we could satisfy the WPAP requirements by using temporary and interim measures, or whether we had to have final measures the entire time. And if you think about it, it makes no sense. I dig a hole 7 feet, I implement final measures until I have to go down to 9 feet, whereupon I have to implement final measures. And as you might imagine, final measures are much more extensive. They are permanent as opposed to temporary, and therefore much more elaborate. But in one of my memorable moments in arguing a case, I was asked by one of the 3 commissioners, what exactly were we building? Because the interim measures apply to construction, which is underway. And I looked at the commissioner and I said, we are building a hole. And he threw his head back and kind of covered his eyes and said, and I just stood my ground. He goes, I can't believe you said that. And I said, well, it's true. And he said, well, I know it's true, but I didn't think you'd say it. And as it turns out, and this is something that you all need to understand, that in whatever governing body you have to deal with, and in this case, there are 3 commissioners, 2 votes. All you need is 2 votes. You do not need unanimity from your panel. You need a majority of the votes. And in that particular instance, we got 2 votes. The gentleman that asked the question refrained from voting, I think because he was still in shock that I had honestly said we were building a hole.
Building a hole. I love it. So with that, it's all related to groundwater where I was located. So I'm going to turn the next several slides over to Molly and let her present on these. And I think you really enjoy it. So again, it was a major concern, the water pollution abatement plan. Just to preface, the stakeholders were the Barton Springs Edwards Arc Conservation District. They actually confirmed their support of a lawsuit by the HOA Association, even though we had a permit pending with them. And then the city of Austin sued over the WPAP plan. They sued me and the TCEQ. And then lastly, there was 2 groups, Stop the Crusher, which you see the sign, and then Neighbors Organized to Protect the Environment, which is the acronym NOPE, was very creative. So you can go on the next slide.
Okay, so one of the things you have to understand in any project that you're dealing with water, and is that the state has a completely disparate set of regulations for regulating surface water and for regulating groundwater. And here we're going to talk for just a moment about groundwater. These are the groundwater districts that currently exist in the state of Texas. Some of them are formed by legislatures, some of them are formed by local voting. Can you pop to the next slide, please? Okay, that's Texas's major aquifers. Now, you would think that people that wanted to regulate groundwater pumping would regulate the aquifer. They would regulate, because pumping in the middle of the aquifer affects the edges of the aquifer and vice versa. If you could go back a slide, please. The first thing you'll notice is this does not in any way, shape, or form follow the aquifers. And there's a couple of exceptions. And there are a couple of groundwater districts that if you are lucky enough to work in, you will find that much more water-oriented organizations than they are political organizations. And I'll let Dr. Den, the professor, tell you about the difference if you don't know it. But if you look up here in the Panhandle, for example, you will find, and I don't know I don't know what color that is. It's kind of a blue, a tealy sort of blue. All right, that is an underground district that was created in 1951. And there are a few groundwater districts, and you can see that unlike most of the groundwater districts, it does not follow political boundaries, and you have not created a fiefdom. And in your world, when you get out and you start working, one of the things that you'll if you're ever doing a groundwater project, you'll want to go straight to this map and you'll want to do two things. One, am I in a regulated groundwater district? And two, when was it created? Because, for example, these groundwater districts up in the Panhandle were created in the 1950s. And while if you're born in the 50s, as I was, that doesn't sound like very long ago. That's 70 years of learning and working together and coming up with solutions that are water-oriented and designed to protect uses, but to promote certain uses, especially when you get down here into the central part of Texas. Those groundwater districts exist along political lines, and they are political fiefdoms. And if you'll go to the next slide, one of the things you'll notice is that the Carrizo-Wilcox, see that big red, the red and the red stripe, magnificent groundwater aquifer, lots of water, good recharge. Obviously, it has a great big outcrop. And yet, okay, flashback quickly, if you would, Dr. Den, to the previous slide. Look how many groundwater districts you have regulating pumping from that single aquifer. And now I'm going to tell you the thing that you really need to remember, and that is there is something in the water code. It's in chapter 36, and it sets hugely broad boundaries on how each one of these groundwater districts can regulate pumping. And when I say hugely broadly, I mean, okay, you get to prevent waste. Okay, you get to prevent subsidence. And then there are authorizations, such as you can limit pumping to the extent it's reasonable. Great. You can come up with desired future conditions. That is, you can define what the level of the aquifer you would like to see in a certain number of years going forward, and you can strive to achieve that. But I guarantee you, every single one of these groundwater districts has absolutely distinct and separate rules regulating how to permit water, whether you get 2 acre-feet per acre, whether you get 1.5 acre-feet per acre, whether you have to have hearings to get a permit, whether historic use is protected, whether there can be curtailments. And so let me state it differently. Everywhere you see a color and a different color, you have a completely different set of rules to pump within that area. Okay, go to the next slide, please. And the next one. Okay, well, here is the other thing that I want you all to remember about this. This is Texas's river basins. And you can see the big old Brazos River Basin, which is the biggest river that we have. You can see the Guadalupe and the San Antonio that merge down there in San Antonio Bay, the Rio Grande Basin in green. I'm hoping that you have enough geology and physical background that one of the things you will have noticed is that the river basins flow from the northwest to the southeast. People in the same river basin, that is if you look at the Green River Basin that's over on the eastern side, that's where Dallas and Houston, they're in that same river basin. They've had to learn over, the several hundred years that those two municipalities have existed. They've had to learn to get along. You could try to say the same thing about Austin and San Antonio, but the words would not come out honestly. But these people that live in the same river basin have learned to work together. If you go back to the previous slide, our aquifers run in exactly the opposite direction. These people have not learned to work together, and yet they really need to, because the aquifers run from the northeast to the southwest. And if you stick a big sucker in the middle of the Carrizo, you're going to affect that entire aquifer. And the people that are on the edges out more towards the Rio Grande versus the people that are up there next to Louisiana and Arkansas, they're going to be mad, and you have no established political ties to resolve those issues. My personal view is that, and if you'll go back one more slide, Dr. Dan, is that the concept of making groundwater regulation a local political animal was a dreadful mistake. It may have been the only solution. It was passed with Senate Bill 1. The Texas legislature was trying to do a couple of things with water. They were trying to enhance water planning, and I suppose that Buster Brown would tell you the only way he could get support for Senate Bill 1 was to do this to us, which is a travesty and a wholehearted asinine way to regulate groundwater pumping. But it's not going to change before you get out of college. Go on to the next one. Okay, and I'll turn this back over to Jill. Jill says that communication and transparency is the key. I would also tell you that knowing the rules of the game is critically important for you to succeed.
You're on silent. Sorry.
I would just say that is very true, because, I really just thought I had my land and I could go get a permit and drill a well. I had no idea the levels of rules and regulations, from the groundwater district to the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality dealing with the WPAP. So because I thought that, I took the stance that, look, it's my right, and I'm entitled to get this water, and I'm going to get it. And I will tell you that proved to be a wrong stance. And so if you remember the first slide that said it's never too late, this is kind of when I had an epiphany and I went, oh my God, I got to do something different here. And so from that day forward, I really was determined to do the right thing. And so what I did is I hired a public relations team that was really an expert in this industry. They had dealt with quarries before. And I positioned myself in the community to be transparent and communicate. And I was really determined to get things turned around. And more importantly, I hired Molly, which changed the game. And so with that, she also suggested I form a quarry advisory committee. And so I'll talk about that in a second. So I either knew two things were going to happen. I was going to go bankrupt if this didn't happen. Well, if it was God's will, I was going to get it done. So what I did with her suggestion is I engaged the most hostile stakeholders, the people that were the maddest at me, the people that were the most committed to fighting it financially. And I put them on my advisory committee. In our first meeting, I'll never forget, it was in the library in Buda, Texas, and we had an armed guard. That's how hostile the situation was. But in the end, as you'll hear, we ended up meeting at a country club with food and drinks, and it was a very social time versus what we started off in the beginning. Now that didn't happen overnight. And, you know, in the beginning, the people had seen me as cold and arrogant because I wouldn't communicate. And I was getting advice from my environmental consultant to just be quiet, file your permit, and hire a lawyer. And that just didn't work. And so over time, as they got to know me on a personal basis, you know, we really began the path of restoration. And you can go to the next slide. And so knowing that water, it was all about water, groundwater. I'm wanting hundreds of millions of gallons a year. I'm going to run the aquifer. I'm going to pollute Barton Springs down near Austin. I mean, there's so many different, you know, avenues of concern that they had, that I just decided, look, I've got to figure this out. And I needed the water to wash the aggregate. And I needed it to manage our site. And so I just listened to all their complaints and concerns about water. And I will tell you that water took precedent over my rock crushing permit and air emissions. Water was way more of a concern to these people. And so I went on a mission to find technology that would allow me to wash the rock with no water, which just sounds crazy, but I knew it existed because of my background in asphalt. And so I went on a mission and really did my homework, and I found some European technology that I implemented in Texas. And so while I was trying to go find this technology, I kind of just gave the whole water project to Molly, and I just deferred to her expertise on how to handle the pending permits and the upcoming hearing that would have been the first one that this groundwater district was ever going to have. And kind of just let that take its course. So if you can go to the next slide, this plant is dry. It doesn't use any water. And long story short, what it does is it has these little mini vacuum cleaners all over the plant, and it sucks the dust off of the aggregate instead of washing it. And so it really gave me a very positive thing to go back to my community and say, I think I figured this out. I don't think we're going to need water except for dust suppression on the site. We are no longer going to need water to wash the aggregate and, you know, process our materials. And that was a game changer because it really gained my trust with the neighbors. In fact, there was one particular woman that lived in the neighborhood, and she actually ran for position on the Groundwater Conservation District just to fight our case. And when I got to tell her, we don't need this water anymore, even though we had already drilled 2 wells, we had drilled an Edwards well and encased the entire a Trinity well, and encased the entire Edwards aquifer off with concrete to protect it. And then we had also drilled a couple of monitoring wells. And so then we decided, what are we going to do with those? And we had some opportunities to use those with the district. But on this plant in particular, just a couple of BMPs I want to tell you about. You know, not only did you have the closed dust is a closed loop system where the dust was captured by those little vacuum cleaners, and then you see in the slide the covered conveyors. And so that was just another form of dust control, so people aren't seeing a bunch of dust in the air. This plant's actually running at the time, and you really don't see any dust in the air. So that was just huge. We were just really lucky to find that technology and bring it to the United States. We were the first group in Texas to bring it, and I think the second in the U.S. So when I was speaking in my class at Baylor, I was telling him it was kind of just a vision I had of washing rock with no water. And so I was really, really glad that came to fruition. So you go to the next slide. And so, you know, we took the message, new plant, no water, and that really, really spoke to the community. It spoke to the legislators that were against us. And then it spoke to the groundwater district. They couldn't have been happier, you know, now we're not going to need that water, even though we probably would have, I'm certain we would have gotten those permits in the end. We did get our drilling permit. We never even officially applied for the production permit because in the end we had found this technology. Let's see, you can go to the next slide. So my quote was, you know, pay the price today for the privilege you want in the future, enabling that that dry technology when the industry was against me. All the other, established mining operations in Texas, they did not want me to implement this because it was going to be a game changer and it was going to be considered best available controlled technology with the TCQ, and it was determined that. So I got a lot of pushback because it's not inexpensive. It cost me a couple $1 million, to implement that additional technology. But what it saved me in the long run, I'm a firm believer in that. So I liked that. I like that quote. And you go to the next one. So I want to turn this back over to Molly because all this is going on at the same time. We're permitting or trying to permit for water. We're trying to defend our water pollution abatement plan that has a lawsuit from the city of Austin, which is kind of a big party. And then we are also have air permits that are in litigation. So, but there's a happy ending here, and I'd like her to kind of give you a brief on what happened.
Wow, talk about a trip down memory lane. Yeah, well, this was the story about digging a hole. And we did have a lawsuit. I think we lost it at the district court and got it turned around at the Court of Appeals. I will tell you again, in terms of knowing your audience, the Travis County District courthouses are universally manned by Democrat appointees, elected Democrat judges. They tend to respond hostily to our Republican governor's appointments who make all the decisions at the TCQ. And that's just one of those things about knowing the rules of the game. It's not a rule of the game that Democrats are going to rule against you if a group of Republicans approve a permit, but you might want to be able to remember to consider it. And of course, then you get up to the Court of Appeals. And at the time, the third court was a mixture of Republicans and Democrats, which I don't think that helped because we had a 3-0 decision because we were right on the law. And quite frankly, we were right on the law. And I think what Jill did in round 2 on her water pollution abatement plan had a lot of belts and a lot of suspenders. And the city of Austin, and it was outside the boundaries in the ETJ of the city of Austin. I mean, the conclusion was that Austin just didn't have the standing to file an action against us. And with that, their case went away. I wanted to hone in on one thing that maybe you guys have heard about in terms of a water case, but it is a story that hopefully you'll remember the punchline of. About a half a decade ago, Jim Blackburn represented TAP, the Texas Aransas Project. They made a claim that the usage of water, that is surface water, out of the Guadalupe River had reduced the freshwater inflows to the bay, and 19 hooping cranes died as a consequence because it affected the food supply. Jim won that case at the district court. That's got an injunction against the state of Texas for the way that they administered surface water. We went up to the Fifth Circuit. I didn't try the case below, but I did take the case up to the Fifth Circuit. We drew a perfect panel, and they reversed the case, and they reversed it in a manner that Jim couldn't retry it. He just didn't have the facts were never going to line up to meet the Fifth Circuit standard. So, and Jim was undoubtedly extraordinarily disappointed with that decision. He and I found ourselves on the opposite side of another case, a case that involved groundwater. And I looked at him and said, do you want to keep doing this? Are we going to keep litigating every time somebody wants water? And he came down to Seguin, and he and my client broke bread, shook hands, and said, no, let's do something a better way. We have subsequently reached an accord with him, which is applicable to the Edwards Aquifer, and by agreement are doing things that he never would have accomplished as a matter of law. And he says so. Jim writes an annual, grade report card for the coastline. And he has said, because we broke bread and because we're trying to talk sensible and we're not spending all our money on lawyers, we're actually accomplishing mutual goals that are good for the environment. And I also know that in the Deepwater case, the federal judge would have one law firm before every hearing, whether it was a status conference or a really controversial hearing. The judge would require one of the law firms to host happy hour the night before the hearing. And it is really hard. And the judge would show, and the judge's clerks would show, and the judge's administrators would show. So no law firm stayed home. I mean, because you were invited, you had to go. And in a conversation with the judge, he said, it's really hard for people to get nasty with each other the following morning after they've had a bourbon together. So if in your arsenal of ways to work through water deals is break bread with people, it really will help you find a way to achieve a mutual goal as opposed to spending all your money on lawyers and expert witnesses.
A great point. Like I said, our advisory council ended up meeting at the country club with open bar and food. And I will tell you that went a long way because it became more social and human than just my company and my application for permits. Okay, if you go to the next slide. So I say in the end, this endeavor really ended up being a huge success. And what the wins environmentally were, we reduced our groundwater needs by 80%, which is conservative. I think it's more about 90%. And reduced our air emissions by 35%. We were able to consider our already drilled wells, that didn't have the production permit to be used to monitor local groundwater quality. And the district really, really appreciated that. Those enemies became my allies through the advisory council. I have friends to this day from that whole endeavor. And then, I told you I picked mentors and experts. Molly was primarily the main one in that. And then we ended up selling our company after landing a very large contract, the SH-130 toll road. We sold to a company that took it public, and we're watching them continue to run that operation today and do some really cool things. And it was a very long fight, but I do it all over again, knowing what the end entailed. So with that, we'll leave it for questions and answers, but I will tell you the biggest part of this whole thing was over water. So, controversy.